Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise to get you truly well-informed on the complex forces shaping our world. When we talk about global trade, the headlines are almost always dominated by tariffs, those visible taxes on imports and exports that grab immediate attention.
Right, they're easy to understand, easy to report on. A 10% tax here, 25% tax there.
Exactly. We see leaders announce them, analysts debate them, and consumers, well, we often feel their pinch directly. But what if I told you that beneath the surface, a far quieter yet vastly more pervasive set of tools is shaping global trade relationships in ways most of us never fully grasp?
It's a whole hidden layer, isn't it?
Yes.
It's harder to pin down.
It really is. We're talking about non-tariff barriers, or NTBs. These aren't just obscure economic terms. They are a whole universe of regulations, practices, and policies that, while not direct taxes on goods, still manage to restrict or distort trade.
And it doesn't stop there, does it?
Yeah.
There are other huge forces at play.
No, absolutely not. Our deep dive today doesn't stop there. We're also seeing massive agricultural subsidies, particularly in developed nations, that ripple right across the globe. We're seeing a dramatic and potentially seismic shift in the global financial landscape and new, really ingenious forms of geopolitical leverage being deployed by countries eager to assert their influence.
It's a much bigger, more tangled web than just tariffs.
Totally. So today our mission is to unpack these incredibly complex, interconnected dynamics. We're going to explore the accusations leveled against China regarding its NTBs, expose the surprising paradox of U.S. agricultural subsidies and their, well, the far-reaching global fallout.
And then look at the whole money side, too, the dollar itself.
Exactly. We'll examine the growing momentum behind de-dollarization and its profound implications for the global financial order. And finally, look at how countries like India are considering innovative ways to exert influence in this intricate global chessboard. Our goal for you, the listener, is to gain a shortcut to being well-informed, understanding the subtle yet powerful forces shaping the global economy. Okay, let's unpack this.
Indeed. It's absolutely crucial to look beyond the obvious, those visible taxes like tariffs. These non-tariff barriers and other hidden economic levers operate with significant, often unacknowledged power.
Right.
They truly illustrate how nations navigate global trade, not just through direct taxation, but through a multifaceted approach of strategic policies and subtle positions. The complexity lies in their very nature. They're often framed as legitimate domestic policies, which makes them much harder to challenge.
That's a great way to put it, legitimate domestic policies.
Yeah.
So let's start with these invisible walls, China's non-tariff barriers. When we talk about NTBs in practice, what are we really talking about? You mentioned regulations, practices.
Yeah, it's a broad category. Think regulations, specific standards, licensing requirements, customs procedures, even quotas sometimes. Basically anything other than a direct tax at the border that makes it harder or more expensive for foreign goods or services to compete with domestic ones.
Okay. And China, being the world's largest trading nation, frequently finds itself accused of deploying these tools to tilt the playing field in its favor. What makes these invisible barriers so insidious for global trade, especially for foreign companies trying to enter the Chinese market?
It's precisely their hidden nature, their layers of justification, as you said. Many of these policies often come with what appear to be perfectly legitimate reasons. They might be presented as essential for national security, for public health, consumer safety, or even as part of a grand industrial development strategy.
Like protecting a new industry, for example.
It's exactly. However, critics argue that in practice, they function as thinly veiled protectionism, creating significant, often unfair advantages for domestic Chinese companies and substantial disadvantages for foreign firms. This dual nature makes them particularly difficult to challenge, in global trade negotiations at the WTO, for instance.
Plausible deniability.
Pretty much. It really begs the question, how does this compare to other major economies and their trade practices? And why does China face such specific and persistent accusations?
That's a perfect point to explore. To really understand how this plays out, let's dig into some specific examples, starting with industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises, which we often just call SOEs.
Right, a huge part of China's economy.
Absolutely. The core accusation here is that China lavishly subsidizes key industries. We're talking about sectors ranging from, traditional ones like steel and solar, all the way to cutting-edge industries like semiconductors and electric vehicles, EVs. Critics argue this fundamentally distorts global prices and production incentives on a massive scale.
And there's data to back this up, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. The data here is quite compelling. The OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, for instance, estimates that Chinese SOEs received a staggering $221 billion in subsidies just between 2014 and 2018. And that's just in the aluminum and steel sectors alone.
Wow. Just two sectors.
Just two. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of some smaller nations funneled into just those industries.
And the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, in its 2022 report, got specific about what these subsidies actually look like, right? It's not just handing over cash.
No, not always.
We're talking direct cash injection, sure, but also preferential loans with low interest rates, land use rights given below market price, various tax rebates and exemptions. A whole toolkit.
So from a critic's perspective, the consequence is clear. These subsidies allow Chinese firms to overproduce goods and then essentially dump them onto global markets at below market prices.
Right. Which systematically undercuts global competitors. It makes it incredibly hard, sometimes impossible, for firms in other countries to compete purely on price. It's like running a race where one person gets a massive head start financially.
That analogy of a rigged race certainly rings true for many businesses outside China. Now, China, of course, has its defense. They argue, look, subsidies are commonplace globally.
Which is true, to an extent.
Right. They're quick to point out that the U.S. and the EU also heavily subsidize their own farmers, we'll get to that, and green technology sectors. They also emphasize that SOEs are absolutely crucial to China's economic stability and employment, providing jobs for millions.
And they frame it as strategic planning, too.
Exactly. They assert that many of these subsidies are part of strategic development plans, like Made in China 2025, or the dual circulation strategy, which they claim are fully WTO compliant and just designed to modernize their economy, catch up technologically.
Okay, so moving from subsidies to something perhaps more direct.
Yeah.
Forced technology transfer. This is a really contentious one.
Definitely. Foreign companies operating in China have long alleged that gaining market access, or even just expanding their operations, is conditional upon transferring their proprietary technology to local partners, especially when they're forced into joint ventures or JVs.
It's a fundamental sticking point. You invest billions in R&D, and then you're pressured to just hand over the keys.
Precisely. A U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission report from 2022 stated that a significant portion, something like 20 to 25% of American firms in China, felt they experienced this kind of forced technology transfer.
And that's in key sectors, right? High-value stuff.
Yes, we're talking critical, high-value sectors like electric vehicles, aerospace, high-speed rail, places where foreign companies reported being pressured to share patents, manufacturing processes, proprietary tech, just to enter the market or operate effectively. It's not just a cost, it's giving away your competitive edge.
It's a huge long-term risk. But China pushes back hard on this one.
They do. They point to their foreign investment law, passed in 2020, which formally bans forced tech transfers. Beijing maintains that any such transfers happening before or even after this law were purely commercial decisions, freely agreed upon by companies in negotiations, not government-imposed mandates.
A fine line between commercial negotiation and government pressure, perhaps.
Perhaps. And in a classic counteraccusation, China accuses the U.S. of hypocrisy. They say the U.S. itself engages in weaponizing technology by blocking Chinese firms like Huawei from global markets, citing national security, which China views as just another form of unfair trade practice.
It's a complex tit-for-tat dynamic, definitely. Okay, another common complaint, licensing delays and opaque regulatory approvals. This sounds less dramatic, but can be just as damaging.
Absolutely. Foreign firms consistently claim they face longer, more opaque, or even arbitrary approval processes compared to their domestic Chinese counterparts. This is particularly problematic in sectors like pharmaceuticals, where time to market is everything.
Or financial services, cloud computing, where getting approvals quickly is vital.
Exactly. And the data seems to support these concerns. AmCham China's 2023 Business Climate Survey found that nearly half, 49% of U.S. firms, reported regulatory approval as a serious concern.
And the EU Chamber of Commerce in China found similar things.
Yeah, they noted in 2022 that foreign companies often waited up to 18 months for approvals that Chinese firms sometimes received in mere weeks. Imagine the competitive disadvantage that creates. It's enormous.
18 months versus weeks.
Yeah, that's a barrier. But China argues they've reformed this.
They do. China's defense here is that they've made significant reforms to streamline licensing under their negative list system, which specifies sectors where foreign investment is restricted or requires specific approvals.
So they say things are getting better, more open. Right. They cite a 2021 National Development and Reform Commission white paper that claimed 95% of sectors are now open to foreign investment without joint venture requirements, indicating substantial progress. They also argue foreign firms are treated equally under Chinese law, and any delays are simply due to their rigorous safety, quality, and data standards, which they assert are necessary for public welfare.
Which brings us neatly to a particularly modern and impactful form of NTB data localization and cybersecurity laws. This is huge in the digital age.
It really is. China mandates that data generated within its borders must, in many cases, be stored locally, especially sensitive or personal data. This creates a substantial and costly barrier for global digital service providers and multinational corporations.
What specific laws are we talking about here?
Key legislation includes the 2017 Cybersecurity Law, the Data Security Law, or DSL, from 2021, and the Personal Information Protection Law, PIPL, also from 2021. These have progressively tightened the restrictions.
And the practical impact for a company like, say, Amazon or Microsoft.
It's significant. U.S. cloud providers like AWS and Microsoft often have to operate through local Chinese partners. Critics argue this dilutes their ownership, potentially compromises intellectual property protections, and definitely increases operational complexity and cost. You can't just run your global system seamlessly.
But China frames this differently, of course.
Of course. They frame it as an issue of digital sovereignty and national security, especially pointing to things like the Snowden revelations or accusations of U.S. cyber attacks. They claim their rules aren't fundamentally different from, say, the EU's GDPR or U.S. laws concerning sensitive government or financial data.
So national interest versus the free flow of data.
Exactly. Beijing argues that unchecked foreign digital dominance genuinely threatens China's national interests, and that these regulations are necessary to protect their citizens' privacy and critical infrastructure. But the economic impact on global businesses is undeniable.
Absolutely. Okay, another area. Standards and certification barriers. This feels very technical, but again, can be a real hurdle.
Yes. China is accused of setting unique domestic standards for things like safety, technology, or quality that are often incompatible with established international norms. This forces foreign firms either to redesign their products specifically for the Chinese market, which is expensive, or undergo costly, sometimes redundant, tests and certifications.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Historically, they had different telecom standards, like TD-SCDMA for 3G, which mandated specific technologies less common elsewhere. They also require a compulsory certification, or CCC mark, for over 132 product categories, things like electronics, toys, auto parts. The process to get that mark can be lengthy and opaque.
And food safety, too.
Yes, there have been instances of what importers claim are arbitrary rejections in food safety tests on U.S. agricultural imports, like soybeans and meat, which they argue serve as non-tariff barriers rather than genuine safety concerns.
So, creating technical hurdles that add cost and complexity, what's China's justification?
They assert these national standards are essential for consumer protection, public safety, and industrial upgrading, ensuring high-quality products for their citizens. They also state that the State Administration for Market Regulation, or SAMR, reports progress, claiming over 39% of Chinese standards now align with international ones, and that number is increasing.
So, moving to its harmonization, they say.
Right. And on food safety rejections, China points to instances of contamination scares abroad and states it maintains a zero-tolerance policy for health risks, regardless of the country of origin.
Okay. What about intellectual property rights, IPR? This has been a sore spot for a long time.
A huge one. Despite China's stated improvements in its legal framework and enforcement efforts, accusations of IP theft persist, particularly in high-tech sectors.
And the scale is massive.
According to the USTR's 2023-301 report, that's a key U.S. trade document, they estimated that U.S. businesses lose somewhere between $225 billion and $600 billion annually due to IP theft, with a significant portion attributed to Chinese entities.
Wow, that's a staggering range. But even the low end is enormous. What kind of IP theft?
Prevalent issues include the theft of trade secrets, rampant software piracy, and widespread counterfeiting of goods, everything from luxury bags to pharmaceuticals. The question really is, despite China's progress on paper, are the deep-seated issues still too pervasive for current reforms to fully address?
But China argues they're making real strides here.
They do. China's defense points to its own impressive progress and what they see as a maturing innovation ecosystem. They note that over 4 million patent applications were filed in China in 2023, more than any other country, which they say signals a vibrant domestic innovation landscape.
And they've set up special courts.
Yes, they highlight the establishment of dedicated IP courts and increased penalties for infringement. They also point out that foreign plaintiffs actually won over 80% of their patent infringement cases in Chinese courts in 2022. So Beijing argues that Western narratives on IPR are often outdated and don't accurately account for the substantial progress and legal reforms they've made.
It's a constantly evolving picture, clearly.
Okay, moving beyond technical barriers. What about quotas and export restrictions, using trade as a more direct lever?
Right. China has employed quotas and licensing systems to restrict exports of strategic materials, effectively leveraging its market dominance. A prime example is rare earths, those critical minerals used in everything from smartphones to wind turbines.
Where China dominates production.
Absolutely, accounting for 70 to 80% of global production. They were famously accused of weaponizing this leverage against Japan back in 2010 during a diplomatic dispute, temporarily cutting off supplies and causing global panic.
And more recently,
as of 2023, graphite and gallium exports crucial for semiconductors and EVs were subjected to new licensing requirements, raising global alarms again about supply chain vulnerability.
And there have been accusations of outright politically motivated bans, too.
Yes, critics point to sudden restrictions on agricultural imports like Taiwanese pineapples or Australian wine, often imposed shortly after geopolitical disagreements, suggesting they were retaliatory rather than based on genuine trade issues. These feel like direct, though maybe undeclared, trade actions. How does China explain these?
China's argument is generally that these measures are about resource conservation, national security, or public health, not political leverage. On rare earths, for instance, Beijing claims it's cracking down on illegal mining and aiming for sustainable use and environmental protection in what can be a polluting industry.
And the agricultural bans.
On those targeted bans, China consistently denies political motivation, citing specific issues like pest infestations, incorrect labeling, or quality control concerns as the official basis for their decisions. It's often very hard to definitively prove otherwise, which is part of their power.
Plausible deniability again. Okay, this leads us to investment restrictions and these complex structures called VIEs, variable interest entities.
Exactly. Foreign investors often cannot own majority stakes in many sensitive Chinese sectors, think media, telecom, education, due to national security or ideological concerns. This frequently forces them into using VIEs.
Which basically legal workarounds.
Pretty much. A VIE allows foreign capital to control but not directly own a Chinese company. They do this via setting up offshore entities, often in places like the Cayman Islands, which then sign a complex series of contractual agreements with the actual Chinese operating company. It's a way to get foreign investment into restricted sectors.
But it sounds risky.
It has raised significant legal and financial risks, especially after China's sudden 2021 crackdown on the edtech sector and tech IPOs abroad. Many foreign investors using VIE structures were left in a very precarious, uncertain position.
And China's view on these structures and the restrictions themselves.
China justifies the ownership restrictions by citing national cultural security and ideological integrity, particularly in sectors deemed strategically sensitive. They do point to progress, noting a gradual reduction in their negative list of restricted sectors, down from 93 in 2015 to just 31 in 2023, indicating a slow but steady opening.
And the VIEs themselves, are they cracking down?
On VIEs, while acknowledging the inherent risks and regulatory gaps, China has so far signaled a sort of tolerance for their existence, likely because they facilitate needed foreign capital, but they clearly desire greater transparency and regulation to mitigate systemic risks and ensure better oversight. It remains a gray area.
Okay, finally, there's something less formal, but maybe just as potent. Retaliatory bureaucracy and informal pressure. Like using red tape as a weapon.
Exactly. Countries have accused China of using regulatory harassment or informal barriers against companies from nations that cross China's political red lines.
Can you give an example of that?
A well-known one. After South Korea deployed the THAAD missile defense system in 2016, which China strongly opposed, Chinese consumers reportedly boycotted Korean goods, tourism plummeted, and Korean firms operating in China, like the Lotto Group, were suddenly hit with numerous, often debilitating inspections and alleged safety violations.
And more recently with Australia.
Yes, in 2020, after Australia called for an independent international investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China responded with a wave of tariffs, bans, and customs delays on a range of Australian products. Beef, wine, barley, coal, causing billions in losses for Australian exporters.
These feel very much like direct retaliation, even if not officially declared as such.
They certainly do. China, however, adamantly denies any direct linkage between political disputes and these trade actions. They consistently blame spontaneous public backlash or legitimate safety and quality concerns, not government decisions.
So they urge the non-politicization of trade.
Even as critics contend that China itself is engaging in exactly that, leveraging its immense economic power to exert political pressure. So what we're seeing is China, arguably, masterfully leveraging ostensibly legitimate domestic policy standards, licenses, subsidies, regulations to create a strategic economic moat, making it incredibly difficult for foreign firms to compete on truly equal terms. It's not usually about outright bans, but a pervasive, subtle warping of the playing field.
That's precisely it. What's truly fascinating here, makes them so hard to counter, is how these barriers, unlike simple transparent tariffs, often have multiple layers of justification and plausible denial. This makes them particularly difficult to challenge effectively in global trade forums like the WTO.
Yeah.
It really raises an important question, though. How does this compare to other major economies, especially those that vocally champion free market principles? What does their version of hidden trade influence look like? Because surely they're not all playing by Marquis of Queensberry rules either.
That's a perfect segue. Because while China faces these accusations of veiled protectionism, the U.S., arguably the world's most vocal champion of free markets, operates one of the most heavily subsidized agricultural systems in the world. So what does this all mean for the global playing field? It seems like a major contradiction. So let's unpack this apparent contradiction. The U.S. champions free markets around the globe, often, lecturing other nations on fair competition, yet it runs one of the most heavily subsidized and corporatized agricultural systems anywhere on Earth. It's not just a few small programs here and there. It's a deep, complex web of government support, aggressive political lobbying, and rapid corporate consolidation that shapes everything from global food prices to international trade tensions, and even, arguably, what ends up on your dinner plate.
It's a huge paradox, isn't it? Preaching laissez-faire abroad while practicing significant interventionism at home, at least in this sector. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer scale of this support is really astonishing and often goes unnoticed by the average consumer or taxpayer.
How big are we talking?
Well, according to the OECD, U.S. agriculture received over $53 billion in various forms of support in 2022 alone. That's $53 billion in 1 year.
Wow. And how is that support delivered? Is it just checks to farmers?
Not entirely. It's funneled through a dizzying variety of mechanisms. There are direct payments, yes, but also massive crop insurance subsidies, where the government pays a large chunk of the premium's disaster relief packages after floods or droughts, price guarantees for certain key commodities, conservation programs that pay farmers for certain practices, and even export promotion schemes designed specifically to help U.S. agribusinesses dominate foreign markets.
And this isn't a short-term thing, right? It's baked into the system.
Oh, absolutely. Looking ahead, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which analyzes federal spending, projects that from 2023 to 2033, just a 10-year window, the U.S. government will spend over $460 billion on farm programs.
$500 billion? Nearly.
Pretty much. And most of that comes via the multi-year Farm Bill, a massive piece of legislation that gets renewed roughly every 5 years and touches everything from food stamps to these commodity supports.
$460 billion. That's a staggering amount of taxpayer money. And here's where it gets particularly interesting and, frankly, quite revealing about who benefits. According to the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, they track agricultural subsidies very closely. The top 10% of farms receive over 75% of these subsidies.
So it's heavily skewed towards the biggest players.
Hugely skewed. This isn't primarily about supporting the small, struggling family farm in the romanticized image many people might have. The historical data confirms this pattern. Between 1995 and 2021, over $430 billion in subsidies were dispersed, with the vast majority going to large-scale, industrial producers of just a few key commodities: corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice.
The big commodity crops.
Exactly. The clear takeaway, as one source bluntly put it, is unequivocally, big farms get big checks. This system disproportionately benefits the largest, most industrialized agricultural operations.
And this concentration of funds has obviously fueled the consolidation trend in farming.
Massively. This disproportionate distribution has, in turn, fueled the relentless rise of corporate agriculture and the decline of the traditional family farm. Consider the historical shift. Back in 1900, a remarkable 41% of the U.S. workforce was actually in agriculture.
Wow, nearly half.
Yeah. Today, it's less than 1.3%. Yet, despite this tiny percentage of the workforce, just 4% of farms account for two-thirds of all U.S. agricultural production value.
It's incredible concentration.
It is. While the average U.S. farm size is around 445 acres, corporate farms often operate on thousands, even tens of thousands of acres, leveraging immense scale, advanced automation, and unparalleled access to capital to a degree that smaller, independent farms simply cannot match. It's a landscape completely dominated by industrial-scale operations.
That's not just the farms getting bigger, right? The companies around the farms are consolidating too.
Exactly. There's significant vertical integration happening throughout the agricultural supply chain, concentrating power in the hands of just a few major agribusiness corporations. These giants dominate at every single stage, from seed to supermarket.
Like who?
We're talking about companies like Monsanto, now part of Bayer, which controls a vast share of the seeds and chemicals market. Then there are the meat processing behemoths, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, Smithfield, where just four firms collectively control over 80% of beef processing and 66% of pork processing across the U.S. That creates what many critics call a classic oligopoly.
Meaning very little competition, huge market power.
Huge power. And let's not forget the grain trading giants, ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, who control the flow of global commodities like corn and soy. This means these few companies wield immense market power, effectively dictating terms from the farm gate all the way to the consumer.
And this affects the farmers themselves, even the ones still nominally independent.
Definitely. A striking number of family farmers now operate not as independent producers making their own decisions, but under strict contracts with these corporate giants. The farmers typically supply the land and the labor, while the corporations control nearly everything else the animal breeds, the specific feed formulations, veterinary care, even the harvesting schedules and processing.
So the farmer takes on a lot of the risk, but has little control.
Precisely. This system, unfortunately, often leads to incredibly low profit margins for the farmers, high debt burdens as they invest in specialized facilities demanded by the contracts, and very little independence. They effectively become cogs in a massive corporate supply chain rather than truly independent business owners. They bear much of the risk, but reap comparatively little of the reward.
So if these big farms get big checks, as you said, what exactly are those checks for? Which crops receive the lion's share of subsidies? And maybe more importantly, what crucial areas are neglected as a result?
Right. The vast majority of these commodity subsidies go to what are known as the Big Five crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. These subsidies primarily prop up industrial-scale monocultures, huge fields growing just one crop, which are highly efficient in terms of yield per acre, but often environmentally demanding, requiring significant inputs like fertilizer and pesticides.
And where do these subsidized crops actually end up? Are we eating all this corn and soy directly?
Not mostly, no. A huge portion goes into the processed food chains. Think high fructose corn syrup in sodas, soybean oil, and countless processed foods. Another massive chunk goes into biofuel production, particularly corn ethanol, which is blended into gasoline. And a very large amount becomes livestock feed for the industrial meat industry, feeding the cattle, pigs, and chickens.
So the subsidies are essentially supporting processed foods, biofuels, and industrial meat production.
Largely, yes. And this skewed prioritization means other crucial areas of agriculture are severely neglected, despite their growing importance for public health and environmental sustainability. Fruit and vegetable growers, often referred to somewhat dismissively as specialty crops, receive minimal direct government support, a tiny fraction of the aid compared to the Big Five.
And what about organic farming or more sustainable methods?
Similarly, organic and regenerative agriculture, which focuses on building soil health and using more sustainable practices, receives a minuscule fraction of the total aid package. This structure fundamentally skews dietary outcomes for the entire population. It leads to a rather pointed and uncomfortable conclusion from critics. Junk food is subsidized, healthy food is not.
That's a stark way to put it. It really makes you wonder if our grocery aisles and maybe our health statistics would look very different if the subsidies were simply redirected towards promoting healthier eating from the ground up.
It's a profound thought, isn't it? especially when we consider the rising public health concerns around diet-related illnesses like obesity and diabetes. But how does the U.S. government justify these massive agricultural subsidies despite their clear impact on global markets and maybe even domestic health? What are the arguments?
Well, one of the primary arguments, often invoked, is national security. Farming is frequently framed as absolutely essential to food security and national defense, ensuring a strong, reliable domestic food supply in times of crisis, war, or global disruption. Keep the homeland fed.
Okay, the food security argument. What else?
Another core justification is supporting rural livelihoods. Subsidies are often defended as a vital lifeline for struggling rural economies. Politicians across the spectrum frequently emphasize the need to support the American farmer, especially during election years, as these rural states often hold significant political sway in Congress and presidential elections. It's politically potent.
Right, the save the family farm rhetoric, even if the money mostly goes elsewhere.
Exactly. Then there are, increasingly, climate and conservation goals tied into it, or at least presented that way. Programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, have existed for decades, paying farmers to leave environmentally sensitive land fallow to encourage biodiversity. More recently, successive farm bills have included new incentives for practices like carbon capture in soils, no-till farming, and other soil conservation methods, attempting to tie some subsidies to positive environmental outcomes.
Greening the subsidies or trying to.
Trying to, yes. And finally, let's not forget trade leverage. Subsidies also function as a powerful tool of trade diplomacy. Export promotion programs funded through the Farm Bill help U.S. agribusinesses aggressively enter and dominate foreign markets, giving the U.S. significant bargaining power in international trade negotiations. It helps ensure demand for those subsidized commodities.
Okay, so those are the justifications. But this system, despite its various rationales, has profound and often detrimental global fallout, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The most immediate and perhaps most painful impact is on farmers in the global south, in developing countries. U.S. subsidies artificially depress global prices for key commodities like cotton, corn, and wheat, making it incredibly difficult for producers in poorer countries to compete fairly, even in their own domestic markets sometimes.
Can you give an example?
Sure, the cotton example is classic. African countries like Mali, Benin, and Burkina Faso, where cotton is a major export crop and source of livelihood for millions, lose vast sums each year because cheap, heavily subsidized U.S. cotton floods global markets, driving down the price they can get. It undermines their primary path out of poverty.
So it directly harms developing economies.
Directly. Similarly, subsidized U.S. corn and wheat often undercut local farmers in Latin America and parts of Asia, leading to their displacement from farming. This often results in painful urban migration, severe income volatility, food insecurity back home, and ironically, sometimes increased dependence on foreign food aid. As our source bluntly put it, highlighting the sheer injustice. Free trade. This isn't even fair trade.
That's a powerful statement of global inequity. And it's not just economic hardship. These subsidies are a constant source of international trade disputes, right? Fights at the WTO.
Constantly. The Brazil-U.S. cotton case, which ran from 2002 to 2010, was a landmark WTO World Trade Organization dispute. Brazil successfully proved that U.S. cotton subsidies were illegal under international trade rules because they distorted markets and harmed Brazilian farmers. The U.S. ultimately had to pay Brazil hundreds of millions in compensation and modify its programs.
So there are mechanisms to challenge this, but it's tough.
Very tough and takes years. U.S. subsidies remain a frequent point of contention in WTO agriculture negotiations,
Right.
particularly from large developing economies like India and China and from the African group nations, who argue passionately that these subsidies fundamentally undermine fair competition and development prospects. This, predictably, leads to accusations of hypocrisy, doesn't it? When the U.S. criticizes other countries for market distortion.
Absolutely. When the U.S. criticizes countries like India or China for market distortion through their own subsidies or non-tariff barriers, critics are incredibly quick to point to the massive scale of U.S. farm support. They often highlight politically targeted bailouts, which look even less like free market principles.
Like during the trade war with China.
Exactly. Take the staggering $28 billion Trump-era farm aid package from 2018 to 2020. This aid was specifically designed to compensate U.S. farmers hurt by the retaliatory tariffs China imposed during the trade war. That $28 billion was more than twice the size of the entire auto industry bailout during the 2008 financial crisis.
Wow. That puts it in perspective.
It really does. Such actions significantly erode the U.S.'s credibility when it tries to act as the global champion of genuinely free and fair markets.
So what comes next for this deeply entrenched system? Is there any real momentum for reform? It seems like such a powerful lobby.
There is growing debate. Progressives, for instance, are increasingly calling for a fundamental redirection of these subsidies, moving away from supporting just commodity crops and towards promoting more sustainable farming practices, building rural resilience beyond just agriculture, and specifically supporting smallholders, beginning farmers, and farmers from minority groups.
In concrete proposals.
Groups like the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition actively advocate for subsidies to be directly tied to measurable environmental and social outcomes, rewarding farmers for things like improving water quality, sequestering carbon in soil, or contributing to local food systems.
Has the current administration made moves in this direction?
The Biden administration has indeed made some efforts. They launched the USDA Climate Smart Agriculture Initiative in 2022, aiming to channel billions into promoting carbon-conscious farming practices through pilot projects and incentives. However, critics argue that while these are positive steps, they don't fundamentally change the core subsidy structures and their disproportionate benefits to large-scale commodity agriculture. Those remain largely untouched.
And what about consumers? Are they driving change?
Consumer awareness and market shifts are definitely at play. We see plant-based foods, organic produce, and local food systems gaining ground rapidly, driven by consumer demand for health, sustainability, and transparency. Yet, paradoxically, these burgeoning sectors still operate in a policy ecosystem heavily tilted towards industrial-scale commodity agriculture. It makes it an uphill battle for healthier and more sustainable alternatives to truly scale up and compete on price without those same levels of government support. Here's where it gets really interesting connecting these threads. If wealthy nations like the U.S. are subsidizing their agriculture on such a massive scale, creating these global ripples and arguably contributing to their own fiscal pressures, how does that impact the very fabric of global finance and the future of the U.S. dollar itself? Is there a link?
Oh, there's definitely a link. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer volume of these subsidies, combined with a growing overall fiscal challenge at home, huge national debt, entitlement pressures, is creating ripples far beyond the farm gate. It directly impacts perceptions of a nation's currency stability and its global financial standing. It raises critical questions about the sustainability of the current international monetary system and the dollar's long-term dominance. It's all deeply interconnected.
That's a crucial link to make. And this brings us to one of the most provocative statements from our sources. The headline really jumps out. De-dollarization is inevitable. The world isn't prepared. This isn't just, a sensational headline from some fringe economic journal. It's presented as a deep exploration into the underlying structural factors, pushing a profound shift toward what's being called monetary multipolarity.
Right, a world where no single currency holds absolute sway like the dollar has for decades. It's a huge potential shift.
Huge. The argument presented is quite stark. The U.S. is facing an emerging fiscal crisis that threatens the very foundation of the post-Bretton Woods international monetary system. This system, established after World War II, has for decades underpinned the dollar's key roles.
What are those key roles again?
It's the undisputed global reserve currency, what central banks hold. It's the issuer of safe haven treasury assets where global capital flows in times of uncertainty. And because the U.S. runs deficits, it acts as the global consumer of last resort, buying goods from the rest of the world.
And this system is now under threat from U.S. fiscal issues.
That's the core argument. We saw some early tremors, perhaps, in late May of this year. Yields on U.S. Treasury bonds, the interest rates the government pays, jumped to their highest level since 2023. This happened right after proposed tax cuts signaled a potential additional $3.8 trillion might be added to the already staggering federal debt, which currently stands at about $36.2 trillion.
Wow. And big names in finance took notice.
They did. J.P. Morgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, a major figure, even publicly called this an impending crack in the bond market. That's a pretty stark warning coming from the head of America's largest bank.
A crack in the bond market. That definitely sounds serious, deeply worrying. So what are the broader implications if this becomes a full-blown U.S. debt crisis? What happens globally?
Well, if global confidence in U.S. fiscal responsibility is truly lost, it directly threatens all those critical roles the dollar plays.
Yeah.
Think about the exposure. Approximately $9 trillion in U.S. treasuries are held by foreign governments and investors around the world.
$9 trillion. Who holds the most?
Major holders include Japan, the UK, In China, they hold almost a third of that foreign-held debt just between them. A sustained loss of confidence leading to falling treasury prices would mean massive paper losses for these central banks, potentially destabilizing their own financial systems.
And beyond central banks.
It would likely trigger a severe liquidity crunch for the global banking system. Banks everywhere rely on U.S. Treasuries as high-quality collateral for countless transactions, lending, derivatives, repo markets. If the value or perceived safety of Treasuries plummets, lending could freeze up globally.
And emerging markets. They often borrow in dollars.
Exactly. For emerging markets, many already fragile, it would almost certainly mean skyrocketing borrowing costs, regardless of their own fiscal prudence. If the benchmark U.S. rate goes way up, their borrowing costs explode, potentially triggering defaults and crises.
Perhaps the most troubling aspect here, and one that highlights the challenge, is the apparent inability or maybe unwillingness of the U.S. political system to actually correct course on the fiscal front.
That's a key part of the argument. The current debt-to-GDP ratio sits at an alarming 121%. That's double the 60% sustainable benchmark often cited by economists.
And historically, how does that compare?
It's a stark contrast. It was under 40% in the 1970s and around 65% just before the 2008 financial crisis, so it's ballooned significantly.
And the politics make it hard to fix.
That's the fear. Hyperpartisanship, where political parties prioritize ideological purity over compromise, and primary election systems that often punish fiscal moderation, have led to what many describe as political paralysis on fiscal issues. The last serious attempt at a comprehensive grand bargain on fiscal reform, for example, famously failed back in 2011 during the Obama administration. It demonstrated just how deep the structural challenges to bipartisan action are.
And it gets worse when you look longer term at the big entitlement programs.
Yes, that's arguably an even deeper fiscal challenge looming. The Social Security Trust Fund, for instance, is currently projected to run dry around 2033. If no reforms are made by then, it could trigger automatic 20% benefit cuts for retirees.
A huge political and social issue.
Massive. Medicare, the health insurance program for seniors, faces similar pressures around 2036, and just the interest payments on the national debt are projected to hit around $2 trillion annually. By then, that's more than the entire U.S. defense budget spent just on servicing the debt.
And demographic trends aren't helping.
No. Adding to this demographic pressure, the U.S. historically relies on immigration as the primary driver of population growth, which contributes to the tax base and labor force, helping to offset an aging population. But amid persistent political dysfunction and increasingly restrictive immigration policies, the argument is that the U.S. is becoming less attractive to potential immigrants, potentially severing what could be a crucial demographic lifeline.
So those are the long-term structural breaking points.
Mm-hmm.
But are there things that could trigger a crisis much sooner, near-term triggers?
Yes, the sources point to several. The U.S. Treasury market itself, the bedrock of global finance, is already showing signs of stress. We're seeing occasional weak auctions, meaning maybe not enough demand from investors at current interest rates.
And the return of the bond vigilantes.
Right, that's a term from the 1980s for investors who basically sell off government bonds to protest what they see as irresponsible fiscal policies, thereby forcing yields higher and demanding fiscal discipline. Their return could force borrowing costs up sharply. The psychological threshold of 5% yields on 10-year treasuries has already been breached multiple times recently. If yields were to settle consistently above 6%, a level last seen before the 2008 financial crisis, the feedback loop could kick in.
What feedback loop?
Higher borrowing costs make the deficit worse, which spooks investors more, leading to even higher borrowing costs. It could quickly become a self-reinforcing, dangerous downward spiral for the bond market.
A doom loop, essentially. And the credit rating agencies are already ringing alarm bells.
They are. It's quite significant. S&P Global Ratings downgraded U.S. debt from its top AAA rating way back in 2011 after a debt ceiling fight. Fitch Ratings followed suit in 2023. And Moody's, the last of the big three agencies holding out, completed the trifecta just last month, stripping the U.S. of its last AAA rating.
What does that practically mean?
Well, it can trigger forced selling by certain large investment funds or central banks that are mandated by their own rules to only hold AAA-rated securities. But perhaps more importantly, it's a major signal. The alarming reality, as our sources point out, is that U.S. sovereign risk, according to these agencies, is now arguably comparable to countries with BBB plus ratings like Italy or Greece. That's a striking downgrade in perception, reflecting how markets are starting to assess U.S. fiscal sustainability regardless of official reassurances.
These vulnerabilities, this perceived risk, must be what's driving this talk of de-dollarization, right?
Yeah.
Countries looking for alternatives.
Precisely. These U.S. budget deficits, combined with the controversial dollar weaponization, using sanctions and access to the dollar system as foreign policy tools against countries like Russia, Iran, and others, plus general political unpredictability and maybe an erosion of global trust in U.S. leadership, have all accelerated efforts by countries and blocs around the world to reduce their dependence on the dollar.
Which blocks are we talking about?
We're seeing moves from BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now expanded the European Union, ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia, and various African nations. They are all accelerating efforts to trade more in their own currencies or find alternatives.
And what kind of initiatives?
Key initiatives include setting up direct currency settlement mechanisms. For example, allowing trade between India and Russia using rupees and rubles directly, bypassing the dollar. Or China and Brazil trading in yuan and real. We're also seeing active discussions about regional alternatives like the long-discussed eco-currency for West African states.
And China's digital currency plays a role.
A significant one, China's digital yuan trials for cross-border settlements and its aggressive expansion of bilateral currency swap agreements with other central banks, basically agreements to lend each other their own currencies, are playing a big role here. They offer practical, real-time alternatives to using the dollar for trade and finance, especially for countries wary of U.S. sanctions.
So it's not just theoretical talk anymore. It's concrete action, widespread action, driven by both economic prudence and geopolitical strategy. And all of this brings us back to an old but highly relevant concept in economics, the Triffin Dilemma. Can you explain that for us? Why is it so critical here?
Absolutely. The Triffin Dilemma is a fundamental paradox identified by the economist Robert Triffin way back in the 1960s. It describes the inherent conflict that arises when one country's national currency, in this case the U.S. dollar, also serves as the world's primary reserve currency.
Okay, what's the conflict?
To meet the ever-growing global demand for dollars needed for international trade, investment, and for central banks to hold as reserves, the U.S. must export dollars to the rest of the world. How does it do that? Primarily by buying more goods and services from other countries than it sells to them. In other words, it has to run persistent trade deficits.
So the U.S. running trade deficits supplies the world with needed dollars. What's the problem with that?
The dilemma is that this very mechanism creates an internal conflict for the U.S. These constant trade deficits, while providing the world with liquidity, can simultaneously weaken U.S. domestic industries, as imports outcompete local production, hollow out its manufacturing base, and significantly increase the national debt as the U.S. borrows to finance the deficits.
So what the world needs, more dollars via U.S. deficits, eventually undermines the U.S. economy and the dollar itself.
Exactly. Eventually, this process erodes global trust in the dollar's long-term stability and the U.S.'s fiscal health. So what the world needs, an ample supply of dollars, is ultimately at odds with what the U.S. economy arguably needs for long-term health. Fiscal balance, strong domestic industries, and currency stability.
And this dilemma is getting worse now.
The argument is yes. The strain of this dilemma is intensifying precisely as more countries actively seek to diversify away from the dollar, reducing their reliance on this inherently contradictory system. They see the growing U.S. debt and question the long-term sustainability.
That perfectly illustrates the deep systemic bind the U.S. finds itself in.
So where is this all heading? Are we looking at a single rival currency, like the yuan or the euro, emerging to replace the dollar? Or is it something else entirely?
Probably not a single rival replacing it wholesale, which is an important distinction the sources make. The world seems to be moving more toward a multipolar currency architecture. Meaning the dollar may remain first among equals for some time, retaining its importance in many areas, but it will increasingly coexist with other major currencies backed by strategic institutions, technological innovation, and new economic networks. Competition is undeniably rising.
From what alternatives? Alternatives mentioned include gold, which is gaining renewed interest among central banks as a neutral reserve asset, free from any one country's control. The Chinese yuan, of course, particularly for trade within Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where China is a dominant partner. Regional settlement systems like those being explored by the African Union or potentially BRICS. The IMF's special drawing rights, or SDRs, that's a kind of synthetic reserve asset based on a basket of currencies, could see an enhanced role. Or even maybe long-term, a common Afro-BRICS currency, though that's highly ambitious. So the future looks more like diversification, a basket of options, rather than just swapping the dollar for the yuan.
That seems to be the more likely scenario painted. Not outright replacement by a single challenger, but a relative decline in the dollar's dominance and the rise of multiple alternatives used for different purposes.
That makes a lot of sense, a more fragmented, but perhaps in some ways more resilient global system. And technology seems to be a major accelerator in this shift.
Precisely. Digital currency technology is a game changer here. It enables instantaneous, low-cost multi-currency transactions that simply weren't feasible before, bypassing the traditional correspondent banking system that often relies on the dollar, like central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
Exactly. CBDCs, which are digital forms of a country's fiat currency issued by the central bank, could enable highly efficient cross-border settlement systems. These could significantly reduce reliance on dollar intermediation, especially for trade between countries that want to avoid the U.S. financial system, perhaps due to sanctions concerns.
And China's digital yuan is leading the way.
China's extensive digital yuan trials, particularly for cross-border trade payments, clearly demonstrate this potential. Imagine a future system, maybe run by the IMF or a new international institution, based on a basket of digital currencies. Such a system could provide inherent stability by diversifying risk across multiple currencies, reducing dependence on any single one, like the dollar. So it's a collective momentum then. Multiple forces, fiscal pressure, geopolitics, technology, all pushing in the same direction.
It absolutely is. The sheer scale and number of countries now actively seeking alternatives creates a powerful collective momentum that really didn't exist even a decade ago. The BRICS nations, for instance, collectively represent over 40% of the world's population and more than a third of global GDP, and they are actively developing alternative payment mechanisms like their BRICS Pay system and financial institutions like the New Development Bank. And this creates network effects.
Potentially, yes. As more countries join these initiatives and start trading in non-dollar currencies or using alternative platforms, network effects could actually begin working against the dollar rather than for it, accelerating its relative decline. We're even seeing the private sector hedging against dollar risk, major commodity traders experimenting with yuan-denominated oil or metals contracts, corporate treasurers developing sophisticated multi-currency cash management systems.
Okay, so given all this momentum, this seemingly inevitable shift, what's the strategic move for the U.S. here? Just try to fight it. The source suggests something quite different, a proactive call for a new Bretton Woods-style reordering of global trade and finance. Why would it be in the U.S.'s strategic interest to lead such an initiative, rather than just trying to desperately maintain the status quo?
It seems counterintuitive, right, giving up privilege. But the argument is it's absolutely in the U.S.'s long-term strategic interest, despite the perceived short-term loss of dominance. Why? Because a thoughtfully redesigned system could directly address those global imbalances and the inherent Triffin Dilemma we talked about by fundamentally decoupling the provision of global reserves from U.S. trade deficits. This could be achieved through shared institutions, maybe coordinated currency mechanisms, or a significantly enhanced role for those IMS special drawing rights, SDRs. This would actually reduce the immense pressure on the U.S. economy to constantly run deficits just to supply the world with dollars, ultimately strengthening its own long-term fiscal health.
And it's not just about fixing the economics, is it? The argument connects to values, too.
Exactly. Some of the sources advocate for a rethinking trade blueprint. This isn't just about tweaking rules, it's about fundamentally redesigning trade architecture around shared values like labor rights, environmental justice, and equitable growth, moving away from systems seen as based purely on economic extraction or power politics. This aligns, arguably, with recent U.S. trade policy shifts towards more worker-centered and sustainable frameworks.
And reforming the institutions themselves. IMF, World Bank.
That's crucial. Such a reordering would provide the opportunity for necessary reform and modernization of the existing Bretton Woods institutions, giving emerging economies fairer voting power and potentially expanding SDR allocations. This could restore their legitimacy and effectiveness in a truly multipolar world, making them more representative and useful for global cooperation.
And in this increasingly fragmented geopolitical landscape we keep talking about, how would a new Bretton Woods help manage that change rather than just reacting to it? It feels like cooperation is low right now.
That's the challenge, but also the potential opportunity. U.S. policymakers themselves have occasionally invoked the spirit of Bretton Woods to justify the need for an inclusive multilateral architecture, one that can actually address pressing global challenges, geopolitical fragmentation, escalating climate risk, the complex governance issues around artificial intelligence. A new framework, the thinking goes, could potentially buffer economic nationalism and systemic shocks by embedding a broader coalition of like-minded economies around shared norms and mutual accountability.
So it's about proactively shaping the future.
Exactly. A proactive approach could preserve U.S. leadership and influence by helping to shape the future global order rather than passively losing influence as the system inevitably shifts around it. It's about leading the evolution, not resisting it until it breaks.
But surely such a monumental shift, a re-architecture of global finance, comes with enormous risks and immense challenges. It sounds almost impossibly difficult.
Oh, indeed, the challenges are formidable. History shows that fundamentally reforming global monetary and trade architecture is incredibly difficult. It requires immense trust, credibility, and shared strategic purpose among nations, qualities that are, frankly, often in short supply in today's fragmented geopolitical environment.
And not everyone agrees on the goal.
No. There are competing visions. Some actors view the original Bretton Woods system as a legacy of Western dominance and inequality, and they seek fundamentally new institutions, perhaps centered elsewhere, rather than mere reform of the existing ones. And then there's the risk of purely nationalistic realignments, like those hinted at by critics of a hypothetical Mar-a-Lago Accord model, which could actually destabilize existing alliances and undermine multilateralism altogether, leading to a more chaotic, fragmented world of competing blocs.
So what's the bottom line? What's the choice?
The source warns, quite starkly, that the choice facing the international community is not whether to end the dollar's uniquely privileged position, but whether that end comes through careful, deliberate preparation and international cooperation, or whether it comes through catastrophic crisis and forced, chaotic adaptation. The recommendation is that policymakers worldwide must begin actively constructing a post-dollar monetary order now, including diversifying reserves into things like gold, accelerating the development of alternative payment and settlement mechanisms before a crisis forces their hand.
A sobering thought. So if the whole global financial system is in flux, what does this all mean for individual countries, maybe like India, that are grappling with these massive global economic shifts and trade pressures, especially when they find themselves in a dispute with a major power like the U.S.? How do they navigate this?
This raises a really important question, doesn't it? In this highly interdependent yet clearly volatile global economy, how do nations, especially large emerging economies facing potential trade disputes, develop new forms of strategic leverage? They certainly can't always rely on traditional tariffs alone, which are often reciprocal and end up being mutually damaging. It seems to require a much more nuanced, almost surgical approach to finding pressure points.
That's fascinating, this idea of surgical pressure points. So we talked about China's invisible walls and the U.S.'s agricultural paradox. Now let's turn our attention to how a country like India might navigate this complex geopolitical chessboard, especially when facing trade pressures from a major power. Our source introduces a really interesting concept, a rare earth-style strategic squeeze.
Okay, explain that. It's not literally about India controlling rare earth minerals, right?
No, not necessarily minerals.
Yeah.
The idea is leveraging unique control over a critical resource or service that a target country, like the U.S. in this hypothetical, cannot easily replace, at least not quickly or without significant pain. It's about finding that specific dependency. Like how China used rare earths against Japan. Find the choke point.
Exactly. And this is framed in the context of a potential scenario. Maybe a future U.S. administration imposes broad, harsh tariffs, say a 25% tariff, plus penalties on Indian goods, as has been publicly floated in political discussions. How could India push back effectively without just getting into a tit-for-tat tariff war?
So it's about identifying an Achilles heel, a point of specific dependency, the U.S. economy or political system. If India wants to exert pressure in a trade dispute, the question becomes, what does it control or have unique leverage over that the U.S. and specifically politically sensitive administration can't easily substitute away from? It's about creating targeted discomfort for key constituents.
Precisely. And the analysis identifies several powerful potential pressure points that India could, hypothetically, strategically deploy.
Okay, let's go through them. What's the first one? Pharmaceuticals sounds like a big one, often called India's generic drug button.
This is seen as an incredibly powerful lever, and perhaps the closest analogy India has to China's rare earth dominance in terms of critical dependency. India supplies a massive share of U.S. generic drugs, something like 40% of all U.S. generic drug imports by volume, and about 20% of all FDA-approved generics overall.
And these aren't minor drugs, right?
No, this isn't just niche medications. It includes essential, widely used medicines like antibiotics, critical blood pressure medications, cholesterol drugs, even life-saving cancer treatments. Any significant disruption in the supply chain would very quickly cause widespread shortages and immediate price spikes in U.S. pharmacies.
Which hits ordinary Americans directly.
Directly and visibly. This would be an absolute political nightmare for any U.S. administration, especially in an election year, as public health access and drug prices are incredibly sensitive issues for voters.
So how could India play this? They wouldn't just cut off all drug exports, presumably.
Probably not overtly. They could subtly threaten export restrictions on certain critical medicines, maybe framing it carefully as necessary for domestic health security due to a sudden localized health crisis or increased domestic demand, or they could allow prices on U.S.-bound generics to rise significantly. Another tactic could be to publicly announce they are prioritizing supply to other non-U.S. markets, say the EU, Africa, or Southeast Asia, implicitly reducing the volume available for the U.S.
Plausible deniability again. But there are risks for India, too.
Oh, definitely. The key risk for India would be potential global backlash if it's perceived, rightly or wrongly, as deliberately harming patients for political gain. So very careful, nuanced messaging would be absolutely crucial to deploying such a strategy effectively. It's a powerful button, but a dangerous one to push too hard. That's a truly potent lever hitting ordinary Americans right where it hurts. Okay, what's next on the list of potential Indian pressure points?
Second, something maybe less obvious but pervasive: IT services and back-office operations. India is, without exaggeration, the backbone of U.S. corporate IT support and business process outsourcing.
Handling what kinds of things?
Everything from complex banking operations, financial transaction processing, insurance claims, to customer service call centers, software development, and cloud infrastructure management for a vast number of Fortune 500 firms. This isn't just about lower costs anymore. It's about a highly skilled, deeply integrated workforce that has become almost indispensable to American corporate efficiency and competitiveness. So disrupting this would cause corporate pain.
Big time. Even a modest slowdown in outsourcing flows to India, or maybe a reduction in the number of H-1B visas granted to Indian tech professionals coming to the U.S. could cause major operational headaches, project delays, and substantial cost increases for American businesses. It hits their bottom line directly.
How could India leverage this?
Well, they could impose new, stricter data localization rules, for example, requiring U.S. companies to store more data within India, significantly increasing costs for U.S. cloud providers and data-intensive businesses who would have to build new infrastructure. They could also offer targeted tax breaks or incentives specifically for Indian IT firms to prioritize non-U.S. clients, subtly shifting capacity away. Or perhaps more pointedly, they could subtly reduce cooperation on sensitive U.S. cybersecurity projects or data sharing initiatives, raising concerns for American firms about security and operational integrity.
So hitting them where it hurts economically, but also strategically in terms of critical business infrastructure and the flow of essential talent. Okay, how about defense? That often has major political implications with jobs in key U.S. states.
Third, exactly, space and defense partnerships. This is a lever with significant geopolitical weight and direct economic impact back in the U.S. Major U.S. defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Electric, GE, rely on India for billions of dollars in potential sales contracts and increasingly participate in joint production lines in India for critical military hardware.
Like what kind of hardware?
Things like Apache attack helicopters, components for GE jet engines used in fighter aircraft. These involve manufacturing or assembly work happening in India as part of the deals. Cutting U.S. access to India's massive and growing defense market directly impacts U.S. jobs, often in politically sensitive swing states that house these major defense plans.
So India could threaten to buy elsewhere.
Precisely. India could strategically redirect major military orders, say, for fighter jets or naval vessels to European competitors like France's Dassault, or even to Russian or Israeli defense systems, signaling a shift away from U.S. suppliers. They could also cancel or significantly delay high-profile joint defense projects that are vital for U.S. strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific region.
Or even more provocatively.
Perhaps even more provocatively, India could make overtures or invite collaboration with Chinese or Russian tech firms in advanced areas the U.S. wants to dominate or restrict access to, like hypersonics or advanced drone technology. That would send a very strong, concerning message to Washington about India's alternative options and willingness to diverge strategically.
That would definitely send a strong signal, hitting both U.S. strategic aims and sensitive domestic jobs. Okay, what about agriculture? Given our earlier discussion on U.S. subsidies and market access, could India use that as a pressure point?
Absolutely. That's the fourth point. Agriculture access. India, with its massive population and growing middle class, represents a huge potential future market for U.S. farm exports. Things like soybeans, tree nuts like almonds and walnuts, apples, cotton, pulses. And as we discussed, U.S. farm states are politically very sensitive areas, often crucial in swinging elections.
So even symbolic moves could have an impact.
Exactly. Even relatively small or symbolic bans or retaliatory tariffs, like India's 2019 tariffs on U.S. almonds and apples, which were imposed in response to previous U.S. trade actions, generate significant negative headlines and political pressure back in U.S. farm country. It affects a crucial voter base for many politicians.
How could India play this card more strongly?
They could impose new, steep tariffs specifically on these politically sensitive crops, maybe citing new phytosanitary standards or domestic market protection needs. Alternatively, they could publicly announce and expand preferential import deals with non-U.S. suppliers, countries like Australia, Argentina, Brazil, or various African nations, making a point of highlighting how U.S. producers are losing market share due to the trade dispute.
That really brings the trade dispute home for U.S. voters in those regions, making it tangible. What other broader geopolitical plays could India make, given its rising global stature and position between major powers?
Fifth, and this is more subtle but potentially incredibly powerful, India's role as a geopolitical swing player. India's strategic alignment or even perceived neutrality can significantly tip the balance in the escalating U.S.-China competition. The U.S. increasingly needs India as a key partner, particularly in the Quad security dialogue with the U.S., Japan, Australia, and for its broader Indo-Pacific strategies aimed at counterbalancing China's influence.
So if India looks like it's drifting away,
It really hurts U.S. strategy. If India were to subtly or not so subtly tilt more toward Russia or China in key areas like trade, energy partnerships, or military cooperation, it would directly undercut the U.S. containment strategy in the region.
how could they signal that?
India could visibly increase its energy purchases, like discounted oil, and defense ties with Russia. It could deepen cooperation on infrastructure projects with other nations, maybe using frameworks similar to China's Belt and Road Initiative, reducing reliance on Western-led funding initiatives. Or, perhaps most concerningly for the U.S., India could strategically stall on key Quad military initiatives, joint exercises, or intelligence sharing agreements, signaling a cooling of relations and a fundamental reevaluation of its strategic alignment if pressured too hard on trade.
A very delicate balancing act. And finally, something quite personal for many in the U.S. tech sector. Migration and skilled labor flows, which are vital for U.S. innovation.
Absolutely. Sixth potential lever, migration and skilled labor flows. Indian professionals overwhelmingly dominate the U.S. H-1B visa program for skilled workers. They form a key source for tech talent pipelines in Silicon Valley and beyond, and represent a growing number of PhDs graduating from U.S. universities in critical STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
And this talent is crucial for the U.S. economy.
Hugely crucial for U.S. tech competitiveness and future innovation. Any significant curtailing of this supply of highly skilled talent would directly slow U.S. tech development and could potentially impact overall economic growth in the long run.
How could India influence this flow?
Well, India could actively incentivize its top engineers, scientists, and tech entrepreneurs to stay in India, offering new attractive tax breaks, generous startup funding, and programs to create high-tech job opportunities domestically. They could also proactively partner with other attractive destinations for skilled workers, countries like Canada, Germany, the UK, Australia, maybe creating specific brain drain bypass programs to actively offer alternative pathways for its skilled workforce, diverting them away from the U.S. tech sector.
Okay, so those are the potential levers: pharma, IT, defense, agriculture, geopolitics, and talent flow. If India really wanted to achieve maximum impact, say, in response to harsh tariffs, especially in a U.S. election year, what would that combined squeeze strategy actually look like? Which levers are most potent?
The analysis suggests that the closest analogy to China's initial rare earth move, The one with the most immediate high dependency shock value would certainly be pharmaceuticals.
Because of the direct impact on consumers and few substitutes.
Exactly. It's a high dependency sector for the U.S. Shortages would be felt very quickly and very politically, and the U.S. has very few short-term substitutes for many essential generic drugs manufactured in India. It creates an immediate crisis point.
But maybe not sustainable long-term pressure.
Perhaps not on its own or too risky if pushed too far. So for sustained and truly impactful pressure, India would likely need to combine levers. Imagine combining the immediate pharma squeeze for that short-term shock with leveraging IT and outsourcing restrictions for medium-term corporate pain hitting company balance sheets and operational efficiency. And then, simultaneously, making pointed defense procurement shifts away from U.S. suppliers would deliver both symbolic impact, signaling strategic divergence, and a direct hit on U.S. jobs in key states.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly. The overall message from such a combined strategy would be unequivocally clear to policymakers and businesses in Washington. Tariffs and trade wars initiated against India will directly cost the U.S. dearly, hitting both voter goodwill through higher drug prices, supply chain disruptions, or lost defense jobs, and crucial corporate support. This could create a powerful domestic lobbying force within the U.S., pushing strongly for de-escalation and finding a resolution.
That sounds like a very sophisticated strategy, moving way beyond simple tariff retaliation. It's almost like a game of economic chess, or maybe poker, with very high stakes. Can we walk through a potential game theory escalation map? How could India actually play this smart squeeze against, say, a hypothetical U.S. administration focused on aggressive protectionist trade policies?
Okay, let's try to map it out, game theory style. Our players are India, whose goal is tariff relief, maintaining market access, and gaining geopolitical respect, and a hypothetical U.S. administration, let's say led by a figure like Trump, whose goals might be perceived political wins from being tough on trade, using tariffs for leverage, but critically, avoiding obvious economic pain hitting U.S. voters or major corporations, especially in an election year.
And India's key levers are the ones we just discussed: pharma, short-term shock; IT and outsourcing, medium-term corporate pain; defense procurement, symbolic jobs impact; agriculture market access, political optics in farm states; and geopolitical alignment, broader strategic card. Okay, what's stage one, the crucial signaling phase? How does India start?
The goal here for India is subtle. Signal its capacity and willingness to inflict economic pain without actually pulling the trigger yet, just testing the waters and creating some unease.
What actions would that involve?
India could publicly announce it's initiating a review of its export rules for critical generic drugs, perhaps citing the need to ensure domestic supply security due to an imagined local health concern or supply chain issue. This alone would create unease among U.S. pharma distributors and hospitals. Simultaneously, they might announce new Indian tax incentives specifically designed for IT firms that are expanding their operations in Africa or Southeast Asia, implicitly hinting at reduced dependence on or capacity for U.S. clients. And maybe subtly, they could publicly invite European and Japanese defense contractors to present proposals for major upcoming projects, currently under discussion primarily with U.S. firms, clearly demonstrating they have alternative partners waiting in the wings.
And the likely U.S. reaction at this stage?
The hypothetical U.S. administration might initially dismiss this as mere posturing, maybe even double down publicly on the tariff threats to show strength. But critically, behind the scenes, corporate lobby groups in the U.S., the pharma industry, the tech sector, defense contractors would definitely start to murmur their concerns to administration officials and key members of Congress. The first seeds of doubt are sown.
Okay, and if that initial signaling doesn't work, if the U.S. administration doesn't budge, what's stage two, the light pressure phase, moving beyond just signals?
The goal now shifts to causing tangible discomfort in those targeted political and corporate constituencies, making the threat feel much more real.
What actions?
India could selectively delay or deny export licenses for a few specific but widely used generic drugs, maybe certain blood pressure medications or common antibiotics again, potentially framing it carefully using bureaucratic language like enhanced quality control reviews or pandemic preparedness measures. They might also impose a noticeable, say, 30% retaliatory tariff on those politically sensitive U.S. agricultural imports like almonds, apples, and pulses, ensuring it gets significant negative coverage in U.S. farm state media. And perhaps they could announce the postponement of previously scheduled joint defense exercises within the Quad framework, citing unforeseen scheduling conflicts, subtly signaling a strain on the strategic alignment.
And the U.S. reaction now? More serious.
Likely, yes. You'd probably see intensified pressure on the administration from pharma distributors reporting potential shortages and from agribusiness lobbyists complaining loudly about lost markets. Business media outlets would start running more prominent stories about the rising India trade problem, shifting the public discourse beyond just the administration's initial narrative. The pressure starts to build visibly.
So turning discomfort into actual political pain. What happens in stage 3, the escalation phase, if the U.S. still holds firm?
This is where India would need to escalate significantly to cause real widespread pain, making the costs undeniable.
What would that look like?
They might publicly announce they are prioritizing pharmaceutical exports to meet contractual obligations with the EU, Africa, and ASEAN nations, while maintaining U.S. shipments but at a significantly reduced volume. This could create actual noticeable shortages on pharmacy shelves in the U.S. They could potentially pass a new, stringent data localization law that forces U.S. cloud providers and digital service companies to invest heavily in building costly new data centers and infrastructure within India, significantly increasing their operational expenses and potentially impacting services. And crucially, they might make a very public decision to award a major defense contract, perhaps for advanced drones or next-generation jet engines, to a French or Israeli firm instead of the competing U.S. company, resulting in visible headlines about lost U.S. jobs and economic impact in specific states.
Okay, that sounds like serious pain. What's the likely U.S. reaction then?
At this point, the hypothetical U.S. administration would likely face severe political blowback. You'd have pressure from governors and congressional representatives from defense-linked swing states like Arizona, Texas, or Pennsylvania complaining about job losses. Widespread pharma shortages would absolutely dominate national news headlines, creating significant public anxiety. And the U.S. business lobby, representing tech, pharma, and defense, would be pushing extremely hard, both publicly and privately, for tariff rollbacks, as the economic costs become undeniable and politically damaging.
And if, even then, the U.S. administration digs in its heels? What's stage 4, the strategic threat phase? This sounds like brinkmanship.
This is the ultimate brinkmanship stage. The goal here is twofold: offer a clear potential path to resolution, an off-ramp, while simultaneously hinting at potentially irreversible, much bigger strategic moves that could fundamentally alter global power dynamics if the U.S. doesn't take the deal.
How would India signal that?
They could publicly announce exploratory talks with Russia and China on strategic partnerships in sensitive areas like rare minerals supply chains or advanced semiconductor fabrication, raising the specter of a new Eurasian technology and resource alliance that directly challenges U.S. interests. They might threaten a full, though perhaps temporary, suspension of all critical pharmaceutical exports to the U.S. if punitive tariffs persist beyond 90 days, setting a hard deadline and creating immense pressure for a resolution. And perhaps most significantly, they could hint, maybe through diplomatic channels or unattributed leaks, at a fundamental pivot in their military cooperation posture, suggesting significantly increased engagement with the Russia-China strategic bloc if relations with the Quad framework continue to sour over trade issues.
Wow. That really puts the U.S. administration in an extremely difficult position.
Absolutely. They'd face a stark choice: either de-escalate the trade dispute, roll back the most damaging tariffs, and try to claim some kind of deal victory to their domestic political audience, or they risk looking strategically inept, being accused of having lost India to the perceived China-Russia strategic camp, a potentially massive geopolitical setback that would be hard to spin positively.
And finally, assuming the U.S. chooses to de-escalate, what does stage 5, the off-ramp, look like? How do both sides save face and potentially gain something?
Right, the crucial off-ramp. India's offer would likely involve stepping back from the brink, resuming normal pharmaceutical exports, signaling that the doors remain open to future U.S. defense contracts, perhaps delaying, not canceling previous considerations, and reaffirming its existing commitments within the Quad framework, reassuring its strategic partner.
And what would India get in return?
In exchange, the U.S. administration would need to roll back the specific tariffs that triggered the escalation in the first place. They might also commit to fast-tracking negotiations on a limited, mutually beneficial free trade agreement, FTA, perhaps focused on less contentious sectors like IT services, defense cooperation, or energy trade. This would allow the U.S. administration to declare a win: look, we got tough and now we have a new trade deal, while India achieves its primary goal of tariff relief and, importantly, successfully demonstrates its new, potent forms of strategic leverage on the global stage.
This whole scenario really highlights the key strategic principles India would likely employ in such a conflict. Targeting those politically sensitive constituencies, pharma consumers, farmers, defense workers, corporate donors, carefully controlling the tempo, escalating gradually to give the U.S. administration plausible opportunities to back down and declare some kind of victory at each stage. Using that plausible deniability, framing its own actions as purely domestic policy priorities, health security, quality control, rather than direct retaliation, and crucially, trying to keep its other allies and strategic partners informed and relatively comfortable throughout the process.
It's a truly sophisticated vision of modern trade conflict and geopolitical leverage, moving far, far beyond just imposing simple reciprocal tariffs. It shows how interconnected economic dependencies create new pressure points.
Absolutely.
So putting it all together now, we've seen how China uses these often subtle, non-tariff barriers, frequently cloaked in the language of domestic policy or national security. We've explored how the U.S. maintains massive agricultural subsidies that, perhaps paradoxically for a free market advocate, significantly distort global markets and impact developing nations. We've delved into how the dollar's long-standing dominance is being genuinely challenged by a shifting global financial landscape and America's own internal fiscal pressures. And now we've looked at how countries like India are identifying and potentially weaponizing new ingenious forms of leverage in what is clearly a multi-layered, high-stakes game of economic and geopolitical chess. This isn't simple stuff, is it?
Not at all. It's incredibly complex. And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, these individual strategies and national vulnerabilities aren't isolated incidents. They really reflect a fundamental ongoing recalibration of global power and economic relationships. The traditional rules of trade and finance, the ones established decades ago, are being actively rewritten in real time, often with these hidden levers, these subtle pressures, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Nations are increasingly looking beyond conventional tools like tariffs, finding leverage in unexpected dependencies, and this definitely signals a much more complex and potentially much more volatile global economic future ahead. #outro.
And there you have it, a truly deep dive, I think, into the complex and often hidden forces shaping global trade and finance today. We've tried to unmask China's invisible non-tariff barriers, revealing how seemingly benign regulations on standards, data, or investment can act as powerful economic tools, creating strategic moats around key industries.
We've explored the surprising, even shocking scale and profound global impact of U.S. agricultural subsidies, exposing that paradox of a nation championing free markets while simultaneously running a system that distorts global food prices and arguably creates dependency in developing nations.
We've also examined the profound and, as our sources strongly suggest, perhaps inevitable shift towards a multipolar currency world. A shift driven by U.S. fiscal challenges, the strategic use of sanctions, and a growing global desire for diversification away from absolute dollar dependence.
And finally, we've seen the ingenious, if potentially risky ways nations like India are identifying and developing rare earth-style leverage in modern trade conflicts, moving beyond traditional tit-for-tat tariffs to strategically target specific dependencies and project influence in a new era of economic statecraft.
What we really want you, the listener, to take away from all this is simply this. Global trade and finance are far, far more nuanced than just the headlines about tariffs that grab our attention. They are shaped by an intricate, deeply interconnected web of regulations, massive subsidies, profound currency shifts, and highly sophisticated geopolitical maneuvers.
These forces often work silently, operating beneath the surface of daily news, yet their impact is enormous. It affects everything from the prices you pay at your local pharmacy or grocery store, to the jobs available in your community, to the stability of entire economies, and ultimately to the very balance of global power. Understanding these dynamics, even at a high level, is just crucial for anyone seeking to be truly well-informed in today's rapidly changing world.
So we're left with a final provocative thought for you to consider as you go about your day. Given the inherent contradictions we see everywhere in current global trade practices, from wealthy nations preaching free markets while simultaneously pouring billions into subsidizing their own industries, to the fundamental shifts in the global currency landscape, and the new, sometimes aggressive, forms of leverage being employed by nations to protect their interests, how might the world truly redefine what fair trade even means in an era where economic and geopolitical power dynamics are so fluid and interconnected?
And perhaps, just as importantly, what responsibility do we as informed global citizens have in understanding these often hidden levers of power, and maybe even advocating for a more balanced, perhaps more equitable global economic system that acknowledges these complex realities?
That's a powerful set of questions to ponder, something to carry with you beyond this deep dive. Join us next time on The Deep Dive as we continue to explore the hidden currents of our interconnected world.